Welcome to the Grad School Femtoring Podcast, the place for first-gen students of color to prepare for grad school. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Fu, and I will be serving as your femtor, providing you with tips and tricks and everything else you need to know to get into and successfully navigate grad school. For over 10 years, I've been helping first-gen students of color get into top grad programs in their field, and I'm really excited to support you on your academic journey too. All right, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. Today, I have another really wonderful guest who's going to be talking to us all about informal mentorship and mentoring neurodiverse students. Our guest is Stephanie Santos Youngblood, and I'm going to go ahead and get started by reading her bio. Stephanie is a doctoral student in the Leadership and Innovation EDD program at Arizona State University's Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and also holds an MA in Teaching English as a Second Language from Columbia University and a BA in Political Science from the University of Connecticut. She is passionate about supporting first-generation college students and neurodiverse students through their college journeys. Yes. Welcome to the podcast, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I'm going to ask you to do what I typically ask my guests, which is to share a little bit more about yourself, your background, backstory, and your educational trajectory.
Oh my gosh. Well, I grew up in Connecticut, so I'm an LA transplant now. I've lived here for about 10 years. And, growing up, I didn't really know what careers were out there, what jobs were out there. I always talk about them as like the play school or the Lego careers, because if there wasn't a Lego character for it or Lego set for it, I didn't really know it existed. And so as I was going through college, I set my sights on teaching. I didn't know the term first generation college student. I don't think it was really in use in as widespread a way as it is now. And there certainly weren't, centers for first gen students or first to go, or I'm the first, or any of these slogans or centers. And so navigating college, just trying to reach that goal of becoming a teacher, was very much like a trial and error type of experience. And I did teach K-12, ESL, and bilingual ed for a little bit. And I took like the craziest career journey with just so many twists and turns, which I think is more and more common these days, to just kind of see where opportunities take you. And so now I am getting my EDD, hoping to really use that to transform the higher ed landscape to be a place where first gens don't accommodate the school, but the school accommodates and includes and welcomes and really takes full advantage of all the strengths of first gens.
That's a really great way for you to introduce yourself. I feel like that was really succinct too.
I've been doing a lot of job interviews, so I think I'm getting good at it now.
I can tell. I was like, you've done this before.
A few times, yeah.
Oh, so you mentioned kind of like didn't really know what it was like being a first gen student, and then you also mentioned kind of like your interest in teaching, your own experience with K through 12, and now wanting to be in higher education kind of in general. And so I'm wondering, like, at what point did you start to consider the topic of informal mentorship? Well, first of all, like, what does informal mentorship mean? And then, like, at one point, did you realize that that was a thing, either like for you or for the folks that you yourself mentor or femtor?
Yeah. Well, I think informal mentorship, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's those connections that you have that weren't set up by anyone, that weren't made through any kind of formal program. It's just like being set up on a date to meet someone versus just like running into someone, meeting them and deciding to hang out, right? So there are so many people in our lives that are even outside of a campus that serve as informal mentors to us by giving us some kind of life guidance, right? We all rely in some way, shape, or form on our elders. And I'm going to use that term very loosely because sometimes people are younger than us, but they kind of serve as an elder because they have a certain experience. And so we really rely on a lot of those people and that network, which I think is really, really important for especially first-gen students to get through college. Those relationships are what keep people going. And they're so important, and they're not always recognized by a university. They're not always documented. They don't always show up in metrics. And so a lot of times we see these reports. I know I just used this citation in a paper I wrote, so I'm going to throw it out there. But University of California system put out a report where they talked about first-gen graduation rates. And typically those are so much lower than continuing generation students. And so what we see at like UCLA, for example, and other UC schools is that they're almost on par with continuing gen students. And in my experience working for a UC and knowing a lot of UCLA students is that that's not really necessarily because of anything the university formally did to support them and support their retention. It's usually in spite of the barriers that exist. And a lot of that mentorship that they received that really helped them actually graduate was from informal mentors. And in my case, where my interest lies is with the campus service workers. And so these might be custodians, housekeepers, food service staff, maintenance workers, and they tend to be the most diverse workforce on a campus, yet they're an invisible workforce. They're also people that students see probably more than anyone else. If you think about, running into the custodian who might clean in your dorm room, for example, you might see them every day. And often because they are such a diverse population, they provide a bridge back to the community, the culture, the family, that you kind of are in this struggle deciding how much of it you have to leave behind when you're in college, not because you want to, because that's the expectation of this kind of dominant cultural set of norms that exist on a college campus. So what I saw was that sometimes that connection with someone who has not been to college, who, isn't from this country, who doesn't speak English as their first language, who can't help you write a paper necessarily, although sometimes they can, but can't necessarily help you write a paper or fill out your financial aid form, provide the most dense, meaningful, and impactful types of mentorship. And I remember my experience in college just being terrified of all my professors and just anyone I would have to talk to. If someone had an office, I was just like, I don't even know how to enter the office. Like, do I knock? How long do I wait after I knock? Like, what's the system here? But there were people that worked in food service or, even worked in the school store that showed me that I belong there much more than anyone else. And so when I talk about informal mentorship, those are the kind of experiences that I'm thinking about.
That sense of belonging is so important.
Mm-hmm.
I know that, when you're talking about informal mentorship, I wanted to ask if you wanted to share a little bit, just kind of like a shout out to like the book that is coming out too, because I know this is informed by a book in which you're one of the co-editors. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that too? Just because I can't help myself, I want folks to know about it, to buy it, to read it.
Well, before I tell y'all a little about the book, I'm going to give a little disclaimer. Our publisher is Routledge Press. The price that they set on the hardcover is like ridiculous.
Okay, we can check it out from the library.
But yes, what I will tell y'all to do is encourage your school library, your local library, or whatever to purchase a copy, because that hardcover price is really set with that in mind. And in, I don't know, like 18 months, they'll have the paperback out for the rest of us. But the book is about campus service workers supporting first generation college students and that form of informal mentorship. And the way that I kind of got into this was through my role at UCLA, where I was program director for a club, a campus organization called Project Spell. And essentially we had mostly undergraduate students, a few grad students who volunteered, and they worked one-on-one with campus service staff who wanted to improve their English. And so through, pairing all these students up, we saw that most of them were first generation college students. And most of them shared a cultural background or some kind of similarity in like family backstory or background or socioeconomic status as the person they were paired up with. And so what ended up happening is, yes, the volunteer is there to tutor the staff member, but the staff member is just providing this wealth of wisdom, support, all the great things about mentorship that they needed. And so I got together with a couple of my buddies and my own mentors. First is Latanya Reese Miles. Shout out, hey LT.
Shout out to LT.
Everyone knows LT. I feel like everyone listening is like, oh, I know LT, because LT is like, I don't even know. She's up on a pedestal for a lot of us, but she's gonna be mad at me for saying that. But LT is the greatest, and she was running the first year experience program at UCLA. So we linked up. She was working with another friend, colleague of hers named Georgina Guzman. Hey, Gina. And they were working on this because they had their own experiences. I know LT is super close with Walter, who I also know, and he's one of the custodians at UCLA. And so they invited me to jump on as a co-editor. And so for the past 18 months, we've been working on this, just collecting stories of, some personal testimonies, some paradigm shift type of essays, some studies, there's like 25 different chapters in this book. So it's a bunch of different stories. I contributed a story, my own personal experience as a first-time professional. And so it's about to be published. November 30th is the date.
Oh my goodness.
I will get you the link for that. It's from Routledge Press. It's, like I said, it's super expensive, but tell your library to get that because there's almost no literature specifically on this topic. And we did feel that it's a contributor to sense of belonging, to institutional interconnectedness, to student success, retention, all kinds of great things that help first gens.
It's interesting because, well, one, like from my own lived experience, I can totally attest to that, to feeling seen, feeling heard, validated by campus service workers and informal mentors. And then also I've had students when I worked, at UCSB who did research in education, and where those were the stories that would come up in the interviews from the students who were trying to identify better ways to support first-gen students. And some of the students that the mentorship that they received were from their colleagues, like maybe they worked, for like food services, and it was their colleagues that were like giving them that kind of emotional support and validation to keep going. So I think, you're right, there's not enough literature on the topic, and it's really exciting that this book is coming out. By the time I publish this, actually, I believe I'm publishing this on the 26th, or it's that Friday of Thanksgiving week. It'll be a week away from when it comes out. So it'll be really good timing so that folks can kind of pre-order or order depending on when they listen to the episode. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing and for bringing that up. I also, usually I try to kind of segue into the other topic, but I think you're also here to talk about neurodiversity. And I do think that informal mentorship is necessary, and that, a lot of the informal mentorship too kind of ties along with working with kind of diverse students and working with students of different kind of, different parts of like the neurodiverse or neurodiversity spectrum. So I would love for you to kind of share a little bit more about that, about like, what does it mean to mentor neurodiverse students? We probably have all been doing it and not even realizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and what comes with that is we, like you said, we've been doing it and not realizing it. And that means we've probably been developing certain strengths, but also making certain mistakes just from lack of awareness. And so to kind of frame this, I'm neurodiverse. I have ADHD. I'm in the process of doing my assessment or evaluation for autism. And so, which I highly suspect that I have. So, a lot of this comes from my own personal experiences. I'm 36. Actually, my birthday's on Sunday, so I'm about to be 37. So I've lived
Hey,
a
Scorpio.
long. Hey, yes, it's Scorpio season. Everyone, we are not as toxic. We are not as toxic as y'all think. We're just very honest, okay? But it's
my
taking
son is actually just had his birthday, a Scorpio, and on the spectrum, on autism spectrum. And you mentioned Legos earlier, and that's like one of his things, like that is his life.
Yes, his special interest. Hey.
Yeah. So anyway, I just have to put it out there because as soon as you mentioned the Lego, it's just the first thing I thought it was my son, because that's all.
Oh my God.
That's like the majority of his time he spends doing making amazing things.
Yeah, he probably just gets super hyper focused on it, and like the end result is amazing. But it's a good connection to what I was about to say, knowing that you're a parent of an autistic child, because a lot of times the lens for formal mentorship for neurodiverse students and for first gens comes from a deficit lens, comes from a deficit mindset. And it's all about, how do we make the normal people comfortable? What are the deficits that these neurodiverse students, these first gens, whatever the population is, if they're a non-dominant group, there's something that they're doing that doesn't fit in with the norms of the larger group or the dominant group. And most of this mentorship, most of this programming is informed by what will make the dominant group comfortable. And that's where you see a lot of the types of therapies they give autistic children and other neurodiverse children is like, well, why don't you socialize like the rest of us? And that's not really helpful. Like, I don't want to change myself. I'm okay with how I am, and I don't feel like I need to make anyone else comfortable just for the sake of doing it. And so that's why I said, we have been mentoring neurodiverse students and maybe doing some great things, but also maybe being harmful if we're kind of unknowingly taking that mindset, which I can also be guilty of too. There's a really amazing essay by Judy Singer from like 1990s, somewhere in there, where she really coined the term neurodiversity. And she talks about growing up being like disgusted and just humiliated by her mother, who she figures was autistic or neurodiverse. And then when she herself became a mother, she started realizing, oh, I'm neurodiverse too, right? And so we, members of this community, are not exempt from causing harm to each other as well. And so I think the key thing to know if you want to be more inclusive of neurodiverse students is that what you think autism is or what you think ADHD is, and there's a lot of overlap between them, is probably wrong. I know in my personal experience, I think people tend to get this image of like, maybe a middle school white male who is just kind of crazy and like a class clown. And so if I talk about my ADHD in the workplace, that's the image that comes to mind. And that's not, how I am at all. But I do struggle with executive dysfunction. There's times that, I get overwhelmed by the amount of tasks I do and get paralyzed. There's obviously focus issues, but ADHD is really like an excess of attention rather than a deficit of attention. It's actually really needs a name change. I think we need to rebrand it because it doesn't represent, the members of the community.
Okay, and when are you writing that article?
Yeah, that's gonna be the next one.
Because you just like lit a light bulb for me with you saying that, because I suspect my son might also have ADHD or be diagnosed with ADHD, because he's like hyper focused on some things and other things really it can be a struggle. But yeah, thinking of like excess of attention is like, that's so true. That actually like makes a lot more sense.
it's like, where do you focus your attention? Sometimes, for me, it's like I have to, let's say I have to clean my apartment, and I could be one of those people that's like, well, let me just, start here and I'll kind of like see how far I get. But in my mind, I have to have the time, the energy, the motivation, the plan to do all of it. And if I can't, then I kind of freeze up. I kind of get paralyzed. And that's, my executive dysfunction. And there are strategies around that. But it's one of those things that people don't know a lot about. And so there are stereotypes. There are a lot of, I don't have to tell you, there are stereotypes that exist around autism that are completely false, and that are harmful, that are hurtful. I've had the thought probably every day of my life of like, why do people hate us? We're not hurting anyone, but people hate us. I left a job recently because my boss, told me that I wasn't normal. Wow. And this is someone who's on a school board for one of the largest school districts in the country, who has a child herself. And, for me, I'm thinking, you don't have to tell me I'm not normal, because I've been reminded my whole life. But what you could do is get to know me a little bit and understand that maybe my brain just works differently, in the same way that you as a Latina want, people who aren't Latina to understand your cultural background. Like I'm just asking you for the same thing. And my experience has been that as soon as people get in their counter space, they use that to be really exclusionary and cause harm to other people that don't fit into that counter space. And so I guess one of my goals with like this dissertation that I'm starting to work on, and this conversation, and like any future work I do, is to really get people to think about what neurodiversity means, and how to break down your ideas about ADHD, autism, and kind of reset yourself and just be open to connecting with someone that doesn't follow all the rules the way you think they should be followed, but you can still get a lot out of the relationship.
The other thing that comes to mind with you sharing about this is thinking about ableism. I think about ableism all the time for myself, as someone who has a chronic illness, but then I think about ableism all the time with my son, and also my husband is self-diagnosed autistic. And as soon as he made that connection from our son getting assessed and diagnosed, so many things shifted in our relationship, and that helped strengthen our communication, which we've had communication issues for so long. Yeah. Where I'm like, oh, a lot of things like, oh, that was you were overstimulated, having a meltdown, you need space. Or, oh, like, I kept asking you, like, are you even talking to me? That's because you don't make eye contact, like just things that I'm like, a lot of things started to make sense. And that has been my experience, not just with my own child, but also like friends who have children on the spectrum, nonverbal, just realizing actually like we all have our own ways of communicating, and we just have to learn their world or their method of communication or their method of doing things. Like my son, who I homeschool, I'm like, I know timers are great for him, so when he does work, he has his timer. I'm still trying to learn the strategies, and I'm still trying to learn to be more anti-ableist, because there's a lot of internalized ableism. So that's like also kind of like I, as someone who identifies as neurotypical but disabled, it's like a common tension, and that I'm learning, and I'm hoping kind of we can teach others, like, in what ways can we continue to keep learning how to be, anti-ableist? How can we, embrace neurodiversity a little bit more in our mentoring? Because again, I don't get it right all the time. And sometimes I catch myself, and sometimes I don't. And so it's a learning process.
Yeah. And no one does, right? We all have internalized everything-ism, right? Yeah. It's the society we live in. We've been conditioned, and we're all kind of trying to reprogram ourselves. I think for me, one framework that has been very harmful in some ways to me has been well, at least in the way that it's been operationalized. So no hate to the original authors of any of these theories, but I know a lot of the Chicana feminist literature has really been taken by people and used to be exclusionary to people that don't fit into a very certain cultural mold. And so I've had experiences where, people talked a lot about relationships and how important that is to kind of have this cultural intuition and build relationships off of that and these networks. And if you're neurodivergent or neurodiverse, you don't necessarily interact in those ways that are culturally acceptable. And so I think we need to remember that, we can critique our own culture. We can use counter spaces to do that. So when we get in these safe spaces that are, safe spaces where we're kind of among our own, however you want to define that, we need to use that as a space to be self-critical. And there's another book I'm going to shout out. It's by Dr. Misery Keels. She wrote a book on campus counter spaces, and she talks about how we need to have brave spaces. We can't use these counter spaces to just be like, yeah, okay, now we're safe from all, the evil white people out there, or all the neurotypicals, or whatever the group is, right? Like, we have to be self-critical and see the things about, our own cultures that could be improved, because, a better world is possible. We don't have to hang on to constructs that are harmful just because it's the way it's always been done, or it's what we're comfortable with. And, I thank people who educate me on their lived experience, because you're just helping me be more open, less ignorant, and see the ways that I'm harming people, which I don't want to do at the end of the day.
Wow. There's so much to unpack there. I think when I hear you and I'm trying to listen and like process what you're saying, at the end of the day, for me, like, I feel like this is a conversation about social justice, is learning and embracing mentoring neurodiverse students is another branch, another aspect of social justice. And it's also about being willing to continuously sit in discomfort. And that's basically how we, like you said, we become less ignorant. That's how we learn more. That's how we kind of hopefully are less hurtful to others and make this world a better place. And I wish we could say a little bit more, but I don't want to kind of like push you to say even more, but I think there's so much there. When you mentioned about this idea of like questioning your own culture, or being in a counter space where you feel safe enough to be able to question it, because some cultural norms are actually are hurting some of us. So I just that is staying with me. I'm gonna keep thinking about it, because I have like in again, I'm coming to you from my own kind of lived experience, and how much we have struggled, because not only are we a neurodiverse family, but we're also a mixed family. We're also bicultural, biracial. And so there's a lot of tensions from like culturally, there's that tension, the communication, the way that we kind of interact and we kind of experience the world. There's a lot of tension. And I myself am still trying to learn, what are the kind of best practices to hopefully kind of both in my family and then with relationships with others, and what we teach others, kind of the folks that I mentor, femtor, to hopefully kind of make it a ripple effect. I
think the biggest barrier to that is that most of us who are not white males are not diagnosed.
Yes.
And so we don't know.
Women and people of color. Go ahead. Sorry. I just got really excited when you said that, because I'm like, yes, big yes.
It's true. And so you think that you are lazy. You think that there's something wrong with you. You just internalize a lot of really self-hating messages, because you don't understand how your brain works. And as soon as you're like, oh, I got this diagnosis and now I know why I do the things I do, all of a sudden you understand yourself better. That's the first step to loving yourself more, to, you know, kind of having some power over your life. You know, I know my brain is like this, and how do I hack my own brain to like make it so that I'm not dysfunctional all the time when I really need to get something done, right? And that also helps you communicate to others what your needs are. And I've talked to a lot of young women. I mean, I feel like I'm kind of like the ADHD whisperer, because I will talk to usually like young women that I've worked with at UCLA, and they tell me a couple things and I'm like, oh, you have ADHD. I mean, don't take my word for it, go talk to someone, but I just feel like you are one of us. And I think that's like the secret superpower that neurodiverse people have, is that we just always know. We see someone kind of like being suspicious of a fork or something, and we're like, you're one of us.
All the time he's like, know. This person's probably this person's probably that. And I'm like, stop, and then he just keeps going.
No, we just know it. Like there's these little things, and they're not the common symptoms, but they're just these random things where I'm like, you're one of us, please go get tested. And I'm thinking of someone in particular, I'm not going to say her name, but she went through a lot with her parents. You know, her parents thinking she's lazy too. I mean, you get the message that you should be ashamed of yourself from like every corner of the world, and including from yourself. And, you know, for her to go and get this diagnosis, I think it was that first step in being able to ask for what she needs from her family, from, you know, maybe a workplace, from school. But the reality is that first step is a huge step. It's been everything for me. I only recently got diagnosed a few years ago. It's been huge for me. But it's kind of like you take this big first step, and then there's a huge barrier in your way, because your workplace will begrudgingly maybe accommodate you if your accommodations you know, are reasonable, which, like,
whatever that means.
I'm like, can you treat me like a human being? Like, is that like, do I have to put that in writing that I want y'all to just treat me normally like you treat everyone else? And they might do it, they might not. They might say it's unreasonable, or they might say that things that are really typical of people with ADHD or autism are unprofessional, and that's kind of like an out. It's a plausible deniability. And so we kind of hit this barrier again where you don't know if you should even reveal it, because people these days know how to discriminate against you without discriminating against you. They know how to get away with it. You know, I say it's kind of like people that get into the system, spend some time in prison, and come out just knowing how to get away with a crime, right? Because it's not really like a rehabilitative process. And so that's what a lot of workplaces, supervisors, managers do. They just know how to make sure that you know that you're different, that you're not part of the group, that we don't like you, and that you're not normal, while still technically meeting your accommodations. And so, yes, is a huge step. Anyone that's listening, I strongly encourage y'all, even if you have like a hint of doubt that some of this might apply to you, go get assessed. But this is where I, like, as a mentor, struggle to give advice to people, because I haven't figured it out. And all I can say is, like, just hope and pray that the job that you take does end up being inclusive. But like you said, there's a lot of ableism. It's not seen in the same way that when people think of diversity, they usually think of cultural and racial diversity, I think, maybe gender diversity. So this is kind of like another identity that's part of who you are when you're born, but it hasn't really kind of reached that level of legitimacy, I think, in most workplaces and most schools. So you'll have professors that you know, accommodate you, but they think that you're scamming, or they think that you're exploiting a system, and that you're really just lazy or weird or something. And so, like, all I can say to anyone that's listening that has felt that is, like, we all need to stick together, because we are our own informal and peer mentors, and there might not be people within our systems that can do that for us. And so we need to create those spaces for ourselves.
Wow. Usually I'm like, oh, so the final words. I feel like that was it right there. What I'm really excited. I'm glad that you came on the show and, offered your time, sharing space with me, because this conversation is critical about, when it comes to destigmatizing it, because I know that a lot of times there's so many barriers to getting assessed. Sometimes the barrier is lack of resources or lack of finances. It can be expensive to get assessed. I know that,
Yep.
firsthand. Even just getting to the location, finding a place, like all that is a barrier. But then even more so, there are like the societal barriers, cultural barriers. When my son was younger, people telling me like, why are you getting him tested? You're trying to find something wrong with him, as if it was a bad thing. They're like, there's nothing wrong with your son. And even sometimes the assessment process in and of itself can feel like it's very deficit based, like just getting asked, what is the problem? It's like, the problem is society. It's not me,
Yeah. Well, I mean, disability, like I don't really consider myself disabled if I was like, in a vacuum, but I feel that I am in the context of the society that we have right now. I feel like I'm the normal one and I just don't understand anyone else. But because like I'm in the minority, I can't really get away with that the way that like, neurotypical people can as a group. And so it is one of those things that you fight for every single day. And no matter, just like being a first gen, it's like no matter how high you climb or how much success you have, you're never really 100% accepted. You're always a little bit on the fringes. And so I'm gonna shout out Bell Hooks real quick, because when I said fringes, it brought to mind one of my most favorite things that's ever been written. That's about choosing the margins as a space of radical openness, and just knowing that it's okay to be on the margins, and that when you're on the margins, what you're doing is expanding that boundary. When you're fighting for anyone that's marginalized, is disenfranchised, and you're out there on that fringe, you're just pushing that boundary, and you're making it so that like our circle of who we include is bigger and broader and wider. And so you're just doing that work, but you don't always see the results. Like y'all might die and need a couple more generations to really like make it happen. And it's often the case with grassroots type of work, right? But just know that resistance that you're putting up, those are tiny steps, right? But they all add up to like pushing that margin back. And like I said, creating a better world for everyone, where we are more open and more accepting of everyone, no matter how different they are, or no matter how like disconnected you personally feel from them. Because I don't need everyone to be my best friend. I don't need everyone to be like, I met Stephanie and she's the most amazing person I've ever met.
I can't say that.
You can, and you should, but I feel like that's what people think, because a lot of these things are taken really personally. It's seen as a personal attack, right? If I say we're ableist. And it's really not. It's just deconstructing like all of these things that we've been conditioned to think. And so when I want more acceptance of neurodiversity, it's not to make everyone my best friend. It's not because I need to manipulate people into giving me a job or publishing something I wrote or whatever. It's simply to pull the knife out of my back, to like really badly paraphrase Malcolm X. It's like, let's just get back to ground level. Right now, the bar is in hell, and we are just fighting to get to ground level. And I think about, I don't know how old your son is, but I hope that when he's my age, things are different.
I hope so too. I hope so.
If they're not, he can call me up and, let me know where to go, who to talk to, but we have to keep pushing. We can't give in to like this kind of normative expectation. We have to fight for ourselves and for our whole community and for whoever's next, whoever we're not.
That's the thing.
that we haven't even realized we're being exclusive of yet.
Sometimes it feels really hard to advocate for yourself, and it feels like, oh, it's, I don't know, selfish. I shouldn't be doing this. It's uncomfortable. But then if you think about it, as you're not, that's when the reason I became really good at advocating for myself was after I had my child. Like in having him and having to learn to advocate for him, I learned to advocate for myself. And so if you think about it as in advocating for myself, I'm advocating for my community.
Yep.
That's gonna change a lot of things. So like, again, ripple effect, you know, one person does it, more people do it. And then we're trying to like push those boundaries, you know, because ableism gets veiled under professionalism, and that's not okay.
Yeah, it's not okay, but a lot of us have also internalized that professionalism is a facet of white supremacy, and we have all internalized that, and a lot of us gain our value from feeling like we are kind of getting closer and closer to that ideal. And you know, I have a friend named Brittany. Hey, Brittany Corville, shout out. She's also a first gen. She's amazing. She's a free Britney Spears advocate, a lawyer. And she talks a lot about like, what if I say no? And that's something that's just been so much on my mind since she said that to me a few weeks ago. It's just, what if we say no? Yeah, this is the norm, but what if I say no to that? Then what? And seeing what happens when you say no, and of course, you have to be strategic about this. Like, I'm not telling people to all go get fired or something. I understand there are realities. We all live in capitalist hell. It's 2021.
We have to pay our bills.
We're all trying to survive, pay the bills, take care of our families and stuff. But thinking about what happens if you say no, instead of kind of tacitly accepting those things that harm you and picking your moment to say no, I think is one of the most empowering things that you can do for yourself, and is something that a mentor can help you with, right? That's the person that's gonna kind of gas you up to go do that, right? And confirm and kind of like push down those doubts that you might have about yourself. And that's the other part of community that I think is so valuable. Is like, yes, you can give to others by speaking about these things, but when you have your own mentor, they can encourage you to speak up for yourself and kind of push aside all those, push aside all of those ideas about humility, right? About being humble and like never kind of putting yourself on center stage. The reality is when you do that, you are speaking for yourself, but you're speaking for like, who knows how many invisible people out there. And especially when you get in a position of power, if you don't do that, I mean, it's a waste. It's such a waste, and it's such a betrayal of, you know, everyone else who shares your identity and doesn't have that level of power to affect change in those ways.
I think that's a great way for us. We're getting close to time for us to get ready to wrap up. If there's any last words, or if someone listens to this episode, resonates, and wants to connect in any way, shape, or form, how can folks reach you?
How can folks reach me? Well, first of all, anyone listening to this needs to go on Facebook and join the Empowering First Generation College Students group. It is lit. We have a lot of fun in there. I am on Twitter, but I literally just made a professional account. And I'm not going to give y'all my Twitter too. I'm not giving y'all my shit posting account. So that needs to be private. So I am going to figure out what my handle is and I'll send that to you. Anyone's welcome to follow me. And yeah, I'll give you some contact info because I'm not really too used to engaging with people.
You know what, the Facebook group is good enough, you know, you don't need to have a million ways to contact you. So whatever link you want to share with me, I'll put it in the show notes. Definitely the Facebook group.
And don't forget, y'all, tell your library to go get our book, Campus Service Workers Supporting First Generation College Students. It is so emotional. If I had more time, I would tell you about like every single essay that's in there, because some of these contributors just, I mean, they have stories, they have stuff to say. And I'm so grateful that they, chose to share those stories with us, because they are honestly it was life-changing for me just to read some of these stories. And so, encourage your schools to, maybe cut back on the econ textbooks and focus on on something like this that can affect a positive change, like right there on their campus.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming today and just sharing so much wisdom and so much knowledge with us.
It was fun to chat. Pandemic life is kind of isolating, and it's great to be in community with you and hear your story too, and hear about your son and your family. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me in the Grad School Femtoring Podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or email me your review at gradschoolfemtoring@gmail.com. You can also show your support by going to gradschoolfemtoring.com and joining my mailing list, where you'll receive weekly tips, podcast and blog updates, as well as discounts for my digital downloads, online courses, and much more. One last thing. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Until next time.